All right, we are live. Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to my weekly Facebook Live Dependent Independent Productions series on how to make podcasting easier. This is where I share tips and tricks for those of you, any aspiring podcasters, or even if you are a podcaster out there and you're looking to do something different, do something new. I've been podcasting. My name's Nick G, and I'm the host, and you're probably watching this on our live stream at the Dependent Independent Productions Facebook page, but we do have our whole back catalog. We must have done about 6 or 7 of these things, and they're sitting right on our YouTube channel at the Dependent Independent Podcast YouTube page. Now, I'm a podcaster. I produce a show called the Dependent Independent Podcast. Been doing it for about 3.5 years. I've learned a few things, and when you're doing something you've never done before and you do it over and over again, things become somewhat easier. So I'm taking all those learnings and passing them off to you. Today, we are going to be talking about, because in one of our past episodes, we talked about content, actually choosing a topic or a subject that you want to do your podcast about. This is a Facebook Live, so there may be some times when people hop on and off. I may comment, so bear with me on that. So when you choose the topic or subject you want to do your podcast on, there's a means on how you record your podcast. We talked about microphones in our past episodes, but today we're going to talk about the difference between scripting a podcast or just winging it and having a conversational podcast. Now, I do a conversational podcast. In 3.5 years, I don't think I've ever scripted one episode. Now, I've planned my episodes, which I get a notepad. Somewhere I just took some notes for this, exactly what I'm going to talk about. So I said in my notes, I already talked about content, and that's not what we're going to talk about in this episode. But I'm a conversationalist. I like having impromptu conversations with people. That's pretty much where my comfort zone is. However, if you decide to do a podcast on a topic that requires, let's say, a lot of research, or you're someone who really wants to make sure you do it exactly the way you want. I don't believe there's anything, I don't think the idea of perfection in podcasting exists. That's why they have ways to edit. That's how, this is a live, I don't expect this to ever be perfect, but this is a live podcast / live stream that I do. How you doing, Todd? Thanks for tuning in. Todd's a big fan of the show. Todd and his wife on one of the biggest downloaded podcasts of the Dependent Independent Podcast, breaking records every day. So thanks for joining me, Todd. So conversations really work for me, but some people really feel, and I listen to those podcasts, a lot of the news podcasts, when there's a lot of information and a lot of data, they feel more comfortable sitting down and actually scripting out their show. Now, as you know as well as I do, when you hear someone talk, you can always tell if it's scripted or not. But that's fine. There's no problem with that. There's no reason you can't share your content or can't absorb content that way. But what I wanted to do in this episode is go through 3 things to consider when you're picking between a scripted podcast and you want to script your own show, or you just want to simply have a conversational podcast similar to the podcasts I do and my wife does at the UBU podcast with Meg and Liv. We don't, neither she nor I, script our shows. So the first thing I want to talk about is time. So when I decide to do my podcast every other week, they post every other week on iTunes. I don't do a lot of sitting down. I used to when I first did this, mainly because you want that control. I wanted to make sure the show went the way I wanted to. Again, that perfection that doesn't exist, I don't think, in podcasting. Hey, Annette, how you doing? Annette Bone, the host of the Dancepreneuring Studios podcast. Thanks for tuning in. The idea of me sitting down and trying to script my show was insane. It just seemed to be way too much overthinking. I think I talked about that on one of our live streams about overthinking leads to poor performance, basically. You overplan. So we simply turn on a microphone and we talk. Now, that takes 0 time. If you're deciding to do a scripted podcast and you really want to go through the effort of scripting everything and putting down everything that you want to say, one thing you need to consider is time. It's going to take you time to research what you want to speak about. If you're speaking about something you're already a subject matter expert on, or you're simply doing research on something that you like or enjoy, you have a passion for, and you want to learn more and then share those learnings on a podcast, you're going to have to spend a lot of time scripting that. Again, conversational podcasts are really kind of somewhat impromptu. I have an idea about or a topic about what I want to do, and I've been doing this for a long enough time to know how to drive the conversation within the time frame that I want to do my episode, whether it be 30 minutes or an hour. But I think you really need to consider time. Scripted shows are going to take much longer, not so much the recording of it, but you're also going to need a lot of time to plan. And if that's your bag, again, that's not something I do, but I know a lot of excellent podcasters out there that they bounce between the two, but their strengths are really on the scripted side. Now, the next thing, number 2, I need you to really think about when you're determining if you want to do a scripted or conversational podcast is your comfort zone. Some people are very comfortable speaking off a script. So if that is within your comfort zone and you feel you're going to be the best when you start off, because you can move from doing a scripted show to a more conversational show, the more practice you get, the more comfort you get. I know people that I public speak at work, and I've public spoken in my career and in my life. I have no problem with that. I think it's really important that you kind of go towards a place that you're going to be comfortable with, especially when you're starting out podcasting, when you've never done it before. Even though just starting it and doing it and getting on a microphone is something that's going to expand your comfort zone. If you really want to make sure your show pops and people listen, you want to plan ahead and determine whether or not you want to write out what you want to say. And there's no shame in that at all, if that's where your comfort zone is. Or if some people don't have the attention span like me. I probably don't have the attention span to run through an entire script. I used to actually plan my show, write out a whole script, and then whittle it down and whittle it down and whittle it down. And my friend Annette, she scripted quite a bit, she said. Let me see if I can get this on here. So my friend Annette, who does the Dancepreneuring Studios podcast, she scripted quite a bit when she started. So not so much now. So like I was saying, you start writing it out to give yourself a kind of an outline so you stay on topic. But the more and more you get into it, the more practice you get, the more comfortable you get kind of driving the conversation. But there are some people out there that, again, I think it really has a lot to do with content. You want to make sure you get your point across and stick to it. And I think some people are excellent writers rather than I don't know if Annette agrees with me, are better writers than they are speakers. So they lean on that comfort zone of writing out what they're going to say because they know they're going to hit their mark and get their point across. Now, the last thing I want you to think about when you're determining whether or not you want to do scripted or conversational, and this one is really more of the technical side, is editing and post. And when I say editing and post, that means the work you're going to do before you publish it. We talked about websites that you publish your podcast so it goes out to iTunes and Stitcher and all these other podcast apps on your phone and wherever you find our show and every other show that I've mentioned on this live stream. When you edit and post, if I'm reading what I'm doing, and this is what the best part about Facebook Live is, I'm going to put Annette's overlay on here. So Annette says, and it's going to be over some questions here, but that's all right. I agree it doesn't have to do with content, and yes, too much people are definitely better writers than speakers, and vice versa. So see, and Annette's a pro. Annette's a pro. I know Annette. I've heard her bounce from both environments on her Dancepreneuring Studios podcast. I think that, and the content that she has is succinct, and it's about dancing and how to use the philosophies of dancing in business. I hope I did you a solid there, Annette. I hope I said that the right way. I feel what your show's about, and you're better off talking about it. So definitely you should check out Annette's show or follow her on Instagram. So, oops, I didn't mean to do that. So when you think of editing and post, and we haven't even talked about editing yet, the more scripted a show is and the more control you have, and I'm usually about garbage in and garbage out. So when you put succinct messaging and it's scripted into the show when you start, you're probably not going to really have to do a lot of editing and post. You'll know when you kind of maybe take a break and you might take a chunk out so it's as if you didn't have an interruption. But if I have a scripted show and I'm rifling through it and speaking succinctly and on that microphone, I want you to think about the fact that you're really not going to have to do a lot of editing and post. When you're winging it and you're doing a conversational podcast, there's a lot of pausing. I mean, you hear, I'm doing this isn't perfect. I even shut that time, number one time thing. I took that off the screen. When you're doing a conversational podcast like mine, you got to improvise a bit. Got to pay attention when things go off the rails. Maybe you have to take notes and look at your recorder and say, oh, it looks like there was an interruption at 26 minutes, and I need to make sure when I go back and post, I take that chunk out. It's a lot less planning in the beginning when you're not scripting your show and you're going full conversational, but you are going to have to do a lot of editing in post. And the more practice you get, similar to what Annette said, Annette started scripting her show and then got really comfortable and then moved to conversational. as I do more and more conversational podcasts and get better at that, I'm almost editing in my head. I know the beats. I'm learning not to say the word or so much. Although my co-hosts sometimes do that, I need to pay attention to that because what they're saying is not scripted. And if even I can note that when you script your show, a lot of interview shows aren't really scripted. I know there's some people that, and I've been asked to be on their shows before, they send me pre-questions and I answer them. And I've seen people edit it where they read the question, then their co-host or guest reads the answer. And that's a scripted show. That's really something that's written out beforehand, but it's recorded and most of the production is done during the show, or pre-production we call it, or that's before. So pre-production and production, which is when we're doing the show, but a lot of the post-production, the editing and post, is when someone who has a conversational podcast is going to have to do a lot of editing. If that's your bag, right? Say it's okay to leave a couple ums and uhs. It's how people talk. I like the natural side of a conversational podcast. It's really what I've built my whole podcast network on and my podcast subject matter on. If you asked me to start doing scripts, it would be very hard for me to do. It's not that I couldn't do it, but it's, let's see what Annette's saying here. Annette says, and I'm really glad you're contributing, Annette. That's why I think people need to give themselves time to stick with podcasting as with anything else, because it takes time to develop unless you're not passionate about it. And she's right. I couldn't have been doing this for 2.5 years or even getting the energy to be able to share these tips and tricks with you on our dependent independent production page without having passion in this. I mean, it's amazing what this podcasting little hobby has done for me, and now I'm able to give all these tips and tricks back. So thanks, Annette, for your comments, and it's great. We actually do this on Facebook on Ecamm Live. Great application. Definitely would love to break it down in a future episode, but if you have an opportunity and you are a live streamer or you're a podcaster thinking of live streaming, this is an amazing app, and I want to thank Annette for referring it, because that's what we do. In our podcast network, we're constantly sharing tips and tricks with each other to help ourselves get better. So again, if you're picking between a scripted podcast format or a conversational podcast format, first you have to pick your content. Again, something that you're passionate about. Really, it's great to start out that way because everyone likes to talk about things that they like, but you have to determine whether or not you want to script out what you're going to do. And when you think about time, if you really like if you're a subject matter expert, it should be easy. Just write it all out. Actually, subject matter experts probably make a really good conversational podcast because they can just wing it. But if it's something new, something you're trying, something you want to use podcasting to learn about, whether it be about cars or the news or sports or whatever it is, thanks, Annette. I really appreciate you tuning in. You got to make sure the time piece, it's going to take a lot of time in the pre-production piece to write out your scripts, have your outline planned, maybe some practice to go through it to make sure that you're hitting all your beats, that it sounds as natural as possible, because obviously conversational sounds a lot more natural than scripted. You can almost hear that, right? When someone gives a public speech, you feel that when they're looking down and reading, or if they're standing up and winging it, there's obviously a different sound to that. So always think about the time. Conversational podcasts really don't take a lot of time to plan. Got to think about your topic, at least that's how I do it, and then a lot of the work comes in when I'm guiding the conversation along when I start the show. 2, you got to think of your comfort zone. If you feel you're more comfortable reading something rather than doing what I'm doing now and just winging it, definitely stick within your comfort zone to start. Like Annette said before, and I said before, it's going to take some time. The more practice you get, you can move from a conversational or a scripted podcast to more of a conversational format, but it takes time. You got to feel more comfortable. You got to hear yourself talk. That's really important too. You pay attention to how you sound when you're on and off the mic. It's great to get some practice before you start recording, but when you turn that microphone on, you're going to hear how comfortable you are whether you're reading or you're actually in a conversational format podcast. So the time, pay attention to how much time it takes on each version or each format. Find the comfort zone where you want to sit. You might be more comfortable with conversational versus scripted. And then lastly, a lot of it has to do with editing and post. There is a amount of editing that's going to have to be done until you get good at it. It's all about garbage in, garbage out, guys. When you are putting in succinct content with less ums, less uhs, less interruptions, and it's flowing on a script, you're really going to not have to do a lot of editing at your post. Taking ums and uhs out, combining things, maybe when you won't really go off in a tangent. You'll stay on topic if you have a scripted podcast. But if you go conversational, you're definitely going to have to fire up some time to edit and take and really refine that show to put out a quality product when you post it on whatever podcast host you're doing on Libsyn, where we post the Dependent Independent podcast and the UBU podcast with Megan Liv. And there's links in the show notes, whether this is on Facebook and you're watching this on Facebook, or you're watching it for posterity on iTunes, or not iTunes, YouTube. See? That's conversational, man. You just kind of go back and forth. You don't get it right every time, but it is a lot more fun to me, and it's a lot more comfortable to have more of a conversation with you guys watching on YouTube and Facebook, and those of you contributing on the Ecamm Facebook Live feed. I want to thank you for tuning in. Again, I hope these tips and tricks helped you. If you want to learn more and need more tips and tricks on how to make your podcasting easier, or you're an aspiring podcaster that needs some help, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm all over the internet at Dependent Independent, at Dependent_Nick on Instagram and Twitter. You can find me on Facebook. There's links in the show notes on YouTube, but if you're watching this, definitely send me a direct message. You can download all of our podcasts. Again, the links are pretty much on iTunes and everywhere else. Oh, yeah, tips and trips, man. You're absolutely right in that. Yeah, I can go on some more trips, too. Thank you, everyone, for contributing on the Facebook Live tonight. I am about to head out. Again, the biggest thing about making podcasting easier is you have more time when it's easier and faster to do what you like to do all the important things like go pick up your daughter from dance, which I'm leaving. Now, this show posts, we try to do these at 8 p.m. every week. Usually they're on Wednesdays, but because I have dance and dad practice, I have to move them to Thursday. So we'll keep doing this till July when our recital is done, and then we'll do these Wednesday. These videos will go up probably in the next day or so, but it's funny. As I'm getting better at this and I'm doing it quicker and faster, I can get these videos on YouTube, and then we'll share them all across our Facebook pages, the podcast page, the productions page, and my personal page. Again, this is Nick Oblish, Nick G, on my podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks, Annette, for tuning in, and I will see you guys later.